Good afternoon, everyone. I hate to do this to you all, to break up the amazing conversations you're having at your table, but if you'll just indulge me, I'd like to express my gratitude to all of you and to the team that has made this gathering possible. I am Michelle Williams, and I'm the Dean of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Let me just say, I'm going to give you a 2-minute personal reflection on pathways to happiness. I know the scientists, my colleague, will be here to talk from a scientific perspective on pathways to happiness, but I just want to share with you my N of 1 experiment. And you know, those of you who are quantitative scientists out in the room will know, never trust a trial that only has one patient or one subject. But here you go. My personal pathway to happiness began when I started as a student in 1986 at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And that was the beginning of a pathway to happiness because that school gave me purpose. And so in my N of 1 experiment, purpose is a very important component. It maybe is one of the first stepping stones on the pathway. The second step for me was when I was invited to come back and join the faculty as chair of the Department of Epidemiology in the dearest school that I love, the Harvard T.H. Chan School. And I came back and I embraced that responsibility with gratitude. And that's the second step in my personal pathway, is being grateful to an institution that gave my life purpose, and then grateful to an institution that gave my life even more purpose, and I would say challenge, leadership challenge, to help contribute to making the school an institution that will be always there, always present, to create generations after generations of leadership. It was in 2014 when our school's name changed. And we are all grateful to Ronnie and Gerald Chan and their family for ensuring that our school will have a century additional legacy of preparing great leaders in public health. And so gratitude is my second path. I would say that you're going to hear a lot from our speakers. And I know that they share with me this deep sense of gratitude to the Lee Kum Kee family for allowing our school to do something that no other school of public health could do. And that is to create a center that actually allows deep scholastic thinking about this question, and that is the approach to positive health and longevity. And the investment in our understanding positive psychology and appreciating the role, investing in the science of positive health, positive psychology in population is never more important than it is now. As you heard from Dr. Sophia, another wonderful alumna of our school talk, it is equally important to think about quality of life as much as it is about the length of life. And so I am delighted to be here to introduce my dear friend, Ronnie Chan, and to thank the Lee Kum Kee family, as well as the Chan family for their enduring support of the work that we do at the school. I want to share with you some news. If you hadn't heard, just last week, Ronnie Chan was in New York to accept the Dwight Eisenhower Global Leadership Award from the Business Council for the International Understanding. Congratulations to you, Ronnie, on this. This is a well-deserved recognition for Ronnie's many, many contributions that he has made to change lives of people across the globe. And I hadn't planned to do this, but when I was in India last week, Ronnie, one of our friends gave me a letter, and I'd like to just take a moment to read this letter. And this is a letter that was written on November 14th, 2018, so just a short time ago, by former President Herbert Walker Bush. And this letter, if you understand the time that we are sitting here, this was perhaps one of the last few letters written by former President Herbert Walker Bush. And so if you'll indulge me, I'd like to read this letter that was written to Ronnie. Dear Ronnie, I don't do much letter writing these days, but when I learned that you are the recipient of the 2018 Eisenhower Global Leadership Award from the Business Council for International Understanding, I had to check in with my personal regards and congratulations. Your indefatigable commitment to build bridges between Asia and the US sets an example, especially among China's emerging generation of philanthropists, for all who want to create a more peaceful world. This recognition of your commitment is fitting and well-deserved, and I join in saluting you. All the best to you, my friend. Sincerely, George. So with that, I would just like to say I'm grateful, I am inspired, and I would like you all to help me welcome Ronnie to this podium.
With that, can I invite the two speakers to join me on stage, Laura and Vish? And while they are making their way here, I just want to mention a couple of things. My executive director, Alice Mong, just mentioned that a couple of weeks ago we had a program here with Professor Sir Michael Marmot from London, University of London, in University College London. And he is an expert on longevity, among other things. And I'm happy to tell you two things. Number one, he is a collaborator with the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health. And number two, we are trying to get him to come here to Hong Kong. And the reason is because Hong Kong people now live the longest. We surpassed Japan and Iceland. So, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are Hong Kongers, doesn't matter you are wherever you're from originally, you're a Hong Konger, and you have an expectation of live longest. I wish. However, Professor Marmot told us that actually, if you were to measure the quality of life of the Hong Kong people as they age, we are not the best in the world. In fact, far from it. So here, I'm waiting for Laura to fix the problem for us, or maybe it is not that big of a scientific problem, maybe it is a communication problem, in which case, Vish, fix it for us, okay? Anyway, so that's the first person I'll mention. The second person I'll mention is that for those of you who have not signed up for the gala, Asia Society annual gala tomorrow evening, please sign up. A table even better, but at least a seat. The speakers, we have two. Originally, we have the executive vice chairman of Alibaba, Joe Tsai. And then I'm very happy to say that Dr. Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank, has also confirmed. And you know what? Dr. Kim taught at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. So, like it or not, you can't get away from us, Michelle. You're ubiquitous. You're everywhere. So it's wonderful. And I also want to point out another gentleman who is in our midst here today, who was a former speaker of ours and a world leader in global health, and that is Professor Ashish Jha. Ashish, raise your hand and stand up. Great to have you again here. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn to the two experts on stage with me here today. I would like each of them to tell us in 5 to 7 minutes what they do, because what they do is what is of interest to us. For example, what Laura does is you study the psychological and the social factors of health and happiness. So later I will ask you how do you define happiness, but we'll leave it until later. So tell us about your work, and then Vish, we'll turn to you after that. Is that okay? Ladies and gentlemen, Laura.
Is this on? Okay. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming out to this wonderful event and for hosting us. It's really a privilege. So to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we do research looking at social and psychological factors and how they influence physical health. So a lot of my work is focused on the interrelationships between mental health and physical health. And that comes out of an interest in sort of how emotions matter for all kinds of behaviors and for serious outcomes. And part of the reason I got interested in that is because in psychology, actually, and in medicine, there's a whole history of what they call mind-body dualism, which says that the mind is separate from the body and that somehow the two don't talk to each other. And that if they do talk to each other, yeah, they talk with some biochemistry and some neurons and stuff, but they don't actually necessarily influence each other. And if they do influence each other, it really goes from the body to the mind. So that, of course, when people are sick, they may be unhappy, but it wouldn't necessarily be the other way around. That if if there are mental states that would somehow influence physical states. And this has been a topic of long-standing debate. So the idea that mind and heart or mind and body are linked has been around for a very long time. You can find references to it from Hippocrates and Aristotle in the Bible, long-standing beliefs about this. But really the idea has waxed and waned over the years and has not always been taken to be credible. It has often been viewed as silly or magical thinking or the stuff that your grandmother will tell you but really has no truth. And I got interested in the question because I felt like actually emotions are the meeting point between where the outside world impinges on the individual and then there are effects on the body. So for instance, if you're, sitting on a podium and giving a talk and there's a bunch of adrenaline running, you feel like, wow, there's something really happening physically, right, that's going on in my body, and that does not feel like there's no connection there between mind and body. So I got really interested in this notion of if mental health states could influence physical health states, what does that look like? How does it happen? And what are the social conditions under which these factors really matter? And it's, as I said, it's been a long-standing debate. In fact, there are some very, very highly regarded biomedical folks who have written very strenuously arguing that this is not possible. So there's an editorial by Marcia Angel, who was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine for many, many years, saying, it would be nice if this is true, but it's not, and we should all move on with our lives and stop believing that emotions matter for physical health. And subsequently, another editor of the...
When was that article?
That was in the late 80s.
Wow.
And then another editor of JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, Arnold Relman, came out with a very similar editorial basically saying it is not possible that mind could influence body. It violates the laws of physics. So I took that as a challenge. And I will say I have dedicated much of my career to sort of disproving that notion, to basically making the case that mental health very strongly influences physical health. And it is often what we think of, to use a sort of phrase, I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with, the canary in the coal mine. So basically a canary in the coal mine says that when there's gas in the coal mine, canaries are much more sensitive and they will actually fall over and die before the people will. So what you do is you put the canary in the coal mine, and if there's noxious releases in the coal mine and the canary is falling over and dying, everyone should get out of the coal mine because, obviously something bad is happening. And I have often said that emotions can be the canary in the coal mine. They give you an early warning signal or an early positive signal of when things are going well or when things are going badly before you necessarily will see the effects on physical health. So much of the work we have done has tried to look at the relationship between mental health and physical health, thinking both about negative emotional states and psychological factors, and then more recently focusing more on the positive. Now I got into looking at positive psychological factors because I started my career looking at things like depression and anxiety. And after a while I decided it made for a very depressing cocktail conversation when people asked you what you did. I did a lot of work looking at the relationships between stress and health, and I would sit on an airplane and someone would say, what is it you do? And I'd say, oh, I study stress and health. And inevitably they would say, oh, you should study me. And then they go on and they tell you your whole life story, and you're like, actually, too much information. So, but after a while, I started thinking, if negative psychological factors influence health, is it possible that positive psychological factors also influence health, or do they just have an effect because they tell you that someone is not depressed? So that's not as interesting, right? It's not as interesting to say if someone is in a positive state, it affects health because it tells you they're not depressed. What would be more interesting and more exciting to discover is if positive states actually have their own independent effect on health, and if they have really, really different pathways we haven't even envisioned. And so I got on to thinking about that, and as I've said to some people, when I started that work, it was my unfunded work. It was the work I did on the side, on the quiet, because it was kind of embarrassing because everybody's like, why are you studying positive states? People are fine. You should look at the problems. Look at what happens when things go wrong. And I increasingly came to believe that if you only ever look at what happens when things go wrong, you will never understand what it looks like for things to go well, and you will not understand what conditions and factors and policies will need to be in place in order to make it possible for people to be functioning optimally. All you will ever understand is how to get people to be not bad, which is really different from being really good, right? So this is part of the idea here of the new approaches to positive health, is that much of biomedicine and public health focuses on the problems and diseases and deficits, which is, of course, incredibly important. But if you're in public health and you're thinking about prevention and you're thinking about population health, then the goal is really to think about how can we get people onto a path where they look really good and they stay good, so they attain good health and they maintain it over the life course, so that you're not just looking at what happens when people decline, but you're thinking about what are the systems that we have to have in place in order to get people onto a healthy trajectory starting from very early in life and right on through till, if they are so lucky to live in Hong Kong and live until if they're a woman, 87 is the number I've been hearing. So what does it take? What are the systems? What are the policies? What are the social conditions that we would need to have in place in order to make that possible? So first, I needed to make the case that positive psychological factors matter for health above and beyond simply telling you that someone is not depressed. And so we've embarked on a whole program of research to try to look at that. We use a lot of existing data to do it. I actually have a lab, and we do some experimental research to also look at this, where we are trying to make the case that positive psychological factors, things like optimism, or as Dean Williams mentioned, purpose, right? Having a sense of purpose and having goals and a sense of coherence in your life. Do these things really influence physical health? Can they delay the onset of disease? Can they sort of postpone mortality? And can they increase the likelihood of healthy aging? Because as we've said, just longevity by itself is not terribly interesting if you're living longer but sicker. What is interesting is to live longer with good health, right? So what are the factors that actually help people to attain and maintain good health over the life course? So these are some of the questions that we've been exploring. We've also been interested in what are the social conditions around that? Are there certain social factors that are going to make it more or less likely that people are able to achieve a sense of purpose, to achieve a sense of optimism? We know that these things are about 20 to 25% heritable, which says that there's a lot of room for environmental conditions to come into play, for people to think about what are the kinds of policies that we might have that will allow people to have a better sense of future, to be able to delay gratification and to be able to move on and make choices that are going to be healthier choices, to self-regulate more effectively. So we've been looking at all of those questions as well to try to understand not only what are the psychological factors and are there benefits, but if they are, then what kinds of policies and conditions do we have to set up? Because from a public health, population health, prevention-oriented perspective, those are the questions you're going to ask. What can the governments do? What can organizations do? What can communities do to put in place in order to make this possible? The other piece of this work that's been interesting, I don't know if should I keep going?
Oh,
okay.
excellent. We're enjoying it. Keep going, don't worry. Vish will get his chance.
The other piece of this work that we've been fascinated by is that so much of... I have so much to say. So much of biomedicine has focused on sort of negative biology, I'll call it, right? And negative behaviors, right? What are the behaviors that cause poor health? What are the biological systems that lead to deterioration and ultimately disease onset? And one of the really interesting questions that's come up as we've been doing this work is how little we know or have anything to say about positive biological functioning. What is positive biology? No one really knows. The closest you can get to it is to talk about physical activity, right? We know that physical activity increases all kinds, increases, your heart's capacity, it increases muscle capacity. That's sort of the only example we have of positive biology. And so as we've been trying to understand if these things like optimism and purpose really do lead to better health outcomes, better physical health outcomes, so that people are less likely to develop heart disease, they are less likely to develop cognitive decline and so forth. What are the mechanisms? And what we found is that most people will just talk about the deterioration, right? They say, well, you're less likely to have inflammation, right? Or you're less likely to have unhealthy lipids, which is great. But then we've asked the question isn't there something different and biologically better if you're in these healthier states that we haven't even thought to look at? We haven't even shown a light there because we didn't know to ask the question. And I think you can ask the same questions about behavior. We have sort of our usual array of behaviors. You don't smoke, and you drink in moderation, and you engage in physical activity. But there are probably lots of other behaviors that matter, like you reach out and you make social connections, or you engage in volunteerism, or you engage in what we call productive activity, so you help your kids take care of their kids, and you feel like you have meaning and purpose in your life. So we haven't thought very much about those because so much of the focus has been on when things go wrong. When you actually shift the lens and you ask the question in this really different way, it opens up a whole new way of thinking about factors and conditions and policies that might help people to attain and maintain better health. And it isn't to say that we shouldn't continue to worry about the problems. Of course we should. This is like when I, talk about the work we do where we start looking at kids. It's not to say we should leave behind the adults who are already struggling, right? We care about them too. But it is to say, again, from a prevention perspective, it really allows you to ask a whole different set of questions in a new way that I think will provide some really different insights. So we're really excited about this work and the opportunity that the center has given us to put it on the agenda in a more meaningful way, on the public health agenda, to have a science of positive health in a way that I don't think has happened, at least systematically thus far. And I really want to write the rebuttal to Relman and Marcia Angel to say, this is not your grandma's wisdom. We have really rigorous, really powerful, really convincing evidence that mental health really can influence physical health, and that can be harnessed. It can be harnessed for bad, but it can be harnessed for good as well. So I will just leave it there.
Laura, are you the only person out there that have to fight against all these negative biology, negative healthcare, and all that stuff? I don't know if Marshall Angel is really an angel. It doesn't sound like a good angel to me.
Yes.
But are there other people like you who are gathering forces, doing research, evidence-based, and so forth, that are hopefully moving the narrative in the world?
Well, I am training people as fast as I can. There's a small cadre of folks who are working in this domain, but it's a very small cadre thus far. And one of the reasons we're excited about the center is it gives us a platform and a way to put out a call to train new students and new scholars to, begin to be able to look at these issues. And one of the challenges is it's very interdisciplinary work. So I was originally trained in psychology, then I went on and I did a degree at the Chan School in Public Health, and then I've put it together and I've collaborated with a lot of people on the biology side of things. So it is a really interdisciplinary approach, which makes it, a little bit more challenging to find the people who have the right skill set to do the work. So I would certainly not say I'm the only one. I have some amazing, wonderful colleagues out there who are doing this work. But relative to other fields, it's a small cadre of people, and we are in the process of what I like to call field building to try to, create a larger group of scholars and scientists who are going to be able to carry this work out.
Laura, I got a great idea, but it's an amateurish idea, and I'm infringing on Vish's area. And that is, I think that after a few years of further research, Laura, you should get a Nobel Prize.
I like that idea.
And the reason is this.
It
catches the attention of the world. That there is a thing, a new feel, a new perspective of looking at health and happiness that will hopefully can turn the narrative in the world. So, Vish, Is it because you guys haven't been doing the right job? I mean, you are the... I never understood, why do you need a big-time professor? You know, we heard Vish is a big name. I was like, okay, fine. But, you know, what are you doing in communication? I mean, all that stuff is all crap and not real. It's really communication problem. If you communicate better, the world will be a better place. Or what is it, Vish? Right. Tell us what you do. Why are you in the School of Public Health?
So right now I'm thinking about my own happiness. Everyone's having dessert out there. Here I am sitting talking about it, you know. So seriously, I think first let me acknowledge, you know, I think Ronnie, you and Asia Society for inviting us. You know, we are really delighted to be here, and the Lee family for supporting us, and with the center. I think we are profoundly grateful. And it's all, I should say, indulge, since I have the microphone and as I'm a communications person. It's nice to be back in Hong Kong. And I've been coming here thanks to Professor Chan. We have been collaborating since 2008. And I have been coming here every year for 2 to 3 times, working with them and Professor Lam and others, and teaching a course here at the University of Hong Kong, you know, staying up there in Robinson Road, going down the escalator every evening. So it's nice to be back in Hong Kong, and that has done a lot for my happiness, I should say. So seriously, I think fundamentally, I think, you know, my own research group focuses on 2 issues, I think. And so if one is this notion of framing and communications, and let me just elaborate on that and then go into the issues of policy, right? So there are 2 revolutions that we are all taking advantage of. And I think Sophia's talk illustrated one example of that, right? The biomedical revolution, as a result of which we have been able to take advantage of it. The tremendous advances we have made in both, you know, detecting, diagnosing, and characterizing diseases and finding appropriate medication and solutions for that has actually led to this kind of longevity that we are talking about, right? So that's great. I think, you know, it's wonderful that, you know, if you look at the data in the world, despite the popular impression, in fact, more people are living longer than at any other time. The infant mortality has actually gone down. You know, fewer people are suffering from serious diseases, you know, maternal mortality has gone down. So actually the numbers are looking great, right? So, but the question, you know, one has to ask, and the other revolution, apart from the biomedical revolution, is the communications revolution, right? So there is not one person in this room who doesn't have a smartphone, or 2 or 3 or 4. And they're all surreptitiously checking their messages even as I am speaking. And it's not at all, and my feelings are not hurt. I've just mentioned that. And the fact of the matter is that there have been tremendous, yeah, they are taking notes, exactly. You know, that's what my students say. They're all, you know, when I'm teaching in the class, they're all on their computers and they tell me, oh, we are just taking notes. I think they're actually facing, you know, posting on Facebook or something. You know, can you believe he said that? So seriously, the communications revolution is the other revolution. And the question, you know, we ask in our lab is, how is it that not everyone is able to take advantage of these biomedical and communications revolutions? You know, how is it that the benefits from these revolutions are accruing unequally across social groups? Right? That is a fundamental question that drives our research. So this notion of inequities and inequalities is all pervasive, you know, is all consuming for us. You know, why is it that despite our best intentions, and people's intentions are honorable, despite the technologies we have, despite the platforms we have, we continue to perpetuate those inequities? I'm particularly interested in communication inequalities because I do think communications revolution could potentially lead to bridging these inequalities, can help in leapfrogging, you know, by obviating the need for, say, landlines, you know, and providing, in theory at least, information for everybody who needs it, information that will allow them to act on the scientific advances that we are talking about, right? But that is not happening. And the question is why? Why is it that we are not able to do that? So one aphorism I do want to mention here is that information is not necessarily communications. So we are suffering from information deluge, all over us, all around us. We are all 24/7 online, but that doesn't mean that we are communicating. The notion of social isolation that Laura mentioned, despite the connections we have, day in and day out, we still feel isolated, right? And so I think, we continue to ask this question, why is it that communications revolution is not being taken advantage of? And we have been doing a number of experiments, both randomized controlled trials, in the field experiments, to understand how we can ensure those at the bottom rungs of the ladder can benefit from the revolutions in biomedical revolution as well as the communications revolutions. So that's one of the themes of the research. The second theme that is particularly germane here is this notion of translation. So there are wonderful, the National Institutes of Health spends about $30 billion on research. Their annual budget is $30 billion. Right? If you look at the global research and development spending, it's about $1 trillion. And the question is, how come all that knowledge is not necessarily translating into practical applications, right? They certainly are not drawing from academy. While we are continuing to do our research, there are people out there who are struggling to formulate appropriate policies. There is this, and the question is, why is it that what we do in science as a part of a rigorous research does not translate to influence policy and practice, right? So Laura mentioned mind-body dualism. In fact, I go beyond that. Our work is mind, body, and society, disconnection, the disjunction between mind, body, and society, right? There are conditions in society that preclude people from taking advantage of these things. There are no models. There are no policies, right? There are no platforms which will allow the translation of this knowledge in science to be taken advantage of people out there, right? At the same time, there are very interesting things happening in the world, right? So if you look at, as I said, if you look at a recent book that came out by Steven Pinker on Enlightenment Now, talks about there are more people living under democracy today. And he looks at every major indicator and says things have improved, right? You read the blog post by Bill and Melinda Gates, they talk about the impatient optimist is the title of the blog post. They look at the numbers again, says things are improving. So we are worried about this disjunction. We know a lot about research. We are good at research. We do it all the time. And we publish our papers, like the Marcia Angels of the world, are criticizing us. And there are things that are happening out there where people, policymakers, practitioners are struggling to make policies that are evidence-based who are not benefiting from it. And so our concern is, why is it that what we are doing is not translating and influence policymakers? How is it the concerns of the society are not really influencing what we are doing in our own labs, right? This is the second theme of research that informs our work. So when it comes to happiness, or the multitude of definitions of happiness, so you can ask Laura all the definitions, and that's a tough question.
My next one.
But, psychological well-being, social well-being. In fact, World Health Organization's definition is physical, psychological, and social well-being, right? So it's all three components. And the question is, how is it, that we know what matters, yet it doesn't seem to go, translate, and we seem to continue to worry about what kind of policies do we need to promote this happiness.
Thank you. You asked a question, I'll just repeat it. Laura, what is happiness? I want a more layman's, not definition, but description of what you scientists consider as happiness. The two of you are co-directors of the Center for Health and Happiness. So what is it?
She does happiness, I do translation.
That is such a good question. I think I get that question about once a week. How should I measure happiness? What should I measure? So happiness is actually it's an emotional state that comes under the larger umbrella heading of positive psychological well-being. So psychological well-being encompasses many different facets and forms, right? So it's sort of an orientation to the world. So I'm optimistic. I have hope for the future. I have a sense of purpose. I am happy. I have positive emotional feelings about things. I have a sense of flourishing, meaning that everything feels like it's going well. So happiness in its own right is a single emotional state that occurs sort of, in various settings at various times and so forth. We sometimes talk about chronic happiness as someone who experiences these states pretty frequently. And there is no single measure, chronic happiness, chronically happy, that's a great way to be. You should live a long time.
Thank you.
And your heart is probably really healthy. So there are well over 60 and probably more measures of psychological well-being that scientists have been developing and using over the course of the time that people have been looking at these questions. And, the question always comes up, which one should I use? Which is the best measure? How do I know which one to use? And I will say that one of the first things we did as part of our activities of the center is we created what we call a repository of measures, which is open to the public if anyone is interested, where we sort of documented the most commonly used measures of psychological well-being, certainly in the kind of research that we're engaged in, and those that have been consistently linked with physical health, although there are many other measures that we did not include in the repository because we're most focused on the linkages with physical health. The question of how to measure is a really good one. People keep saying, I don't have the measure. There isn't a measure out there that characterizes what I need. And I think part of the challenge is there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all. There is no single measure of happiness or well-being that I would be able to sit up here and say, if you want to measure happiness or you want to measure psychological well-being, use this measure. It will never happen because it really depends on if you're doing research. So it will depend on the research question. If you're using it as a surveillance method, right? So let's say if the U.S. should be so enlightened as to decide that they were actually going to monitor well-being in the population, which they have not gotten to that point, but the UK is doing this, you would use a very different measure if you were trying to measure psychological well-being for monitoring purposes on a very large scale in the population. You might use a different measure if you're interested in the well-being, say, of your employees, if you run a business, right? You're in an organization. And then you might have a different measure if you're looking in a neighborhood or a community. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. I would say there are quite a few measures out there, and a number of them that we think are actually fairly well developed and have undergone a lot of testing and usage. And so it is measurable, and there is a science of measurement. There are people who actually think a lot about this. We actually had a workshop not that long ago. We brought together a bunch of scholars and investigators to actually have a conversation about, okay, what are the measures that are out there and how do we decide what to use? Because one of the questions we've gotten a lot, particularly from governments, is we want to monitor well-being. What measures should we use to monitor well-being? And on that question, we're still working on that. I would say because it's sort of a new way to think about it, there isn't a kind of off-the-shelf measure. People are still trying to decide what would be the best way to do this because it's very expensive to do these surveillance on a large scale, and so you can't have your ideal measure, which might be 15 items, but it would take people more than a few minutes to answer those items, whereas if you're doing this on a population level, you basically can't take more than 1 or 2 minutes of people's time. So there's a lot of different ways of doing this, and I would say we know a decent amount, but again, it depends on the question and the purpose for what it is you're trying to do when you get that measure. What is it you want to know from that measure?
Vish, you're the co-director. So how do you understand this happiness? How do you communicate? Let me start with that. How do you look at it?
Sure, and this is a debate that Lara and I continue to have internally. While we are debating and we hold our workshops and symposia on how to exactly and precisely measure happiness, there are a ton of reports already out there measuring happiness, right? So Norway is the happiest country in the world, right? Norway.
Or Bhutan.
There are at least 3, depending upon whose measure you follow or believe, the Scandinavian countries keep showing up. On the other hand, if you look at environmental connection to happiness, it's the Latin American countries and Central American countries that can continue to show up. So there are
Philippines is number one in this
there,
part of the world in one study, but anyway.
Hong Kong doesn't show up for some reason, So
we're not happy.
so the question is, I think the way what we are struggling with, and I think this is what Laura is referring to, is if you have a measure and a definition of happiness, how do we know that it is the right definition, right? So one way we use in measurement sciences is, does it correlate with something else, right? Does it lead to something else, right? So that, I think we always think about this in default. I think it's Robert F. Kennedy who said, in a gross national product, or GDP, gross domestic product, measures everything except that which is worthwhile in life. So we know that GDP and GNP are not the best way to do that. Then what is that replaces it, right? So we talk about well-being, psychological, social, physical, but it depends, I think. But there are people who are trying to measure it. Some things come up. A good employment, a fruitful employment continues to be an indicator that promotes happiness. Environmental conditions promote happiness. It depends on the city. If you are in Somerville, which is a suburb of Boston, traffic jams can lead to unhappiness.
Bangalore, where you and I were recently.
So it varies quite a bit, I think. But there is that disjunction again. There is a Global Happiness Council that is actually measuring these things. And then we are trying to struggle and say, okay, what are the precise measures that will be valuable for this kind of thing?
Sorry to bring back something maybe a little bit on the negative side, Laura, because I really like your idea about the positive biology, positive health, well-being, of looking at things and trying to prevent a lot of things and enhance the positive rather than just looking at the negative. But allow me to bring in one negative side, which Dr. Sophia Chan also mentioned, and that is this matter of mental wellness. I was told recently that in Yale University, what is the freshman class that is the most popular? It's a class, huh?
Positive psychology?
No.
Happiness?
No. It is a class on
numbers.
psychology, on self-analysis. And I also read a study recently that says that the number of college students these days who are seeking mental health help and support is greater than ever before. Now, maybe it's because in the old days it's a little bit taboo, and so they don't talk about it. That's what Rick Levin, the former president of Yale, said to me 2 days ago. But is it something that is real, that the society, because of, technology perhaps, that people are actually getting a bit less happy, and mental health is actually negatively impacted? Could that be true? Can you comment on that, both of you? Either one of you?
So I will say, I think it is true, actually. They did a survey, the American Psychological Association did a survey in 2014 where they sort of ask a whole variety of questions, and a big survey on stress, actually. What they found was the most stressed demographic in the country were our adolescents, which is a serious concern. And the American Psychological Association is, of course, focused on psychological factors. They're not so interested in looking at social determinants or the structural factors that might be driving some of these issues. There was a lot of speculation about some of the things you've talked about in Hong Kong about driving pressure and academic pressures and this, notion of an ever-narrowing definition of how to succeed and what it means to be successful, and, sort of losing a lot of opportunities for kids to not necessarily go on the straight and narrow and be successful in school, but to do other things that they could be successful with. They didn't do research on those things, but what they did identify is that it does seem to be a growing demographic of highly unhappy young people who are now, of course, coming into their early adulthood, and these are the folks who are entering into the college years, and many of them are actually in the schools. In fact, the School of Public Health did a forum on mental health on the college campuses, which I think might be available online if people are interested, which Dean Williams was a part of. So I do think it's a real issue, and I actually think one of the paradoxical reflections I've had, so as I mentioned, when I started the work on positive psychological factors, it was the stuff I did in quiet and secret. I was kind of embarrassed to say that I did it because everyone's like, oh, that's so fuzzy and, happy-go-lucky. And what's happened not just with the center, although the center has helped to put it more on the central stage, but I feel like people are just absolutely starving for this information. And part of the reason I think that is the case is because, in fact, levels of unhappiness are rising. And so there is this notion of what can we do? How can we fix it? So I don't think that's just a level of people are more open about things, people are more willing to talk about it. I certainly think there's an element of that. I think there are lots of other structural factors. It comes back to some of the 24/7 connectedness. When you hear news from all around the world. It's not just what's happening in your neighborhood. I think it's much harder to sort of have quiet and restoration, which is absolutely critical for promoting positive mental health. So I don't think that's actually wrong. I do think we're in a place where we need to be asking these important questions about what do we do about it.
Vish, is technology driving us crazy, literally?
Right. No.
Damaging our mental health, perhaps? Because I don't have time to reflect and rest.
Right. My answer is yes and no. In the sense I know Ron is frustrated, but I'm a scientist for a reason, right? I don't want to give you a simple answer, right?
Please.
So to justify my existence. So seriously, so I think, in fact, we will shortly have a paper coming out exactly on this issue of social media and mental health, and because there is a lot of attention, there is a lot of there is quite a good body of work. Which does suggest that social media, particularly social media, are contributing to negative mental health. So there is a fairly decent body of work, but and that's because I think I think if you are like me, who grew up in India, where we did not have TV when I was growing up. We were not rich enough to as a family, we were not wealthy enough to afford a television. In fact, radio was our source of entertainment, and
you do okay, Vish.
So right, and I grew up all right, I don't feel deprived, so but I think if you look at mass media and exposure to information on mass media, there is always a filter. There are gatekeepers, both who are journalists or reporters, as well as the family, the church, our pastors, our priests, who were able to do the gatekeeping for us, who were able to mediate that information, who were able to help us interpret that information. What social media has done is basically take the gatekeepers away, right? So what it does is providing you with a lot of negative information with no mediation of any kind. Wow. And that lets you exposed to all kinds of information. And because that potentially leads to disinhibition, you see a lot of disinhibition on the part of the people flaming others as they call it, saying very harsh things, which you would not say in person, I think. So there is a lot of that. And certainly technology is not helping in that way. And this notion of 24/7 constantly being online, those of us who travel know the pressure of expectations to respond right away to emails and other things continue to make us very unhappy about it. At the same time, what we have found in the paper that will come out will show is that if we rely solely on social media, for emotional gratifications, for validation from other people, you are much more likely to be unhappy. On the other hand, if you use social media as like any other medium in a routine way, you will actually have positive mental health, I think. So it's just not the technology, but how you use the technology matters a lot.
But older folks perhaps may be on average more able to self-control or know how to react to the information. But young people, the teenagers, as you were talking about, I mean, they are quite supple in their mind and they are still growing mentally and physically. And so with all that information impacting upon them, many of them, I would imagine, just think about myself when I was, 15, 16, how do you react to all that stuff?
I think there are tremendous pressures when, so it's adolescents, but also young adults, right? I think there are tremendous pressures on people. When I grew up in India, it's obvious with my accent, When I grew up in India,
communicate well.
When I wanted to get into the School of Communications, I had to take an entrance exam. My grades were not just enough, right? So you do your exams, but you also take an entrance exam. I don't know whether you do it in Hong Kong or not, but you do it in Japan and other places. For me, I think there were 700 people who took the exam for 19 openings. So you can imagine the pressure. Recently, I was asking somebody, right? No, actually, it's not 700 people. It's 70,000 people, 80,000 people taking the exam for 19 openings. So, right? You can imagine the tremendous pressure, the competition that young people face in succeeding now, right? Because and so that's one of it. The other is, the social comparisons. A colleague of mine and others have been doing this work on body images. For example, there are these, how you have to compare yourself with models. As one example of that, these are unrealistic expectations. And I think social media have actually amplified the access to those unhealthy images and unhealthy aspirations, unrealistic expectations, which might be making people more unhappy.
For those of you who don't know my brother, he's tall and handsome and much smarter than I am. So I grew up a little bit damaged. But anyway, Laura, I want to touch upon two issues. One is psychological. The other is social. You talk about optimism. Are there studies that people who somehow defined as more optimistic live longer? People who are pessimistic, is the cup half full or half empty? Anybody who says it's half full, live longer. Half empty, you live shorter. Are there such studies? That's the first question, is, your own internal state, your psychology. The other is the external factors. And we in Hong Kong are very concerned about that because of the pressure, it is said, is very strong in Hong Kong. For example, Hong Kong people walk the fastest anywhere in the world among the big cities, probably. Right? I said in New York City, they walk fast too, but only between the subway station and the office. Once they get to the office, they're very slow. So I never hire an American secretary or assistant. But in Hong Kong, they walk fast, and when they get to the office, man, they work hard for the next 12 hours, very fast and very intense. So stress is strong. So how does that impact our well-being and maybe even longevity?
Okay, so let's see if I get this in order. So optimism, we have done a whole line of research looking at optimism in relation to physical health, and we very, very consistently find that optimism is health protective. So the first study we did on this was in the early 2000s. We found optimism cut risk of heart disease in half. So this was looking at people who were, this was in a sample of community-dwelling men. There were about 1,500 men in the study, and we measured levels of optimism when we knew they were pretty healthy. So we knew they had no evidence of heart disease or anything like that. We tracked them out over, I think it was about 15 years. We measured all kinds of other things, other risk factors, like if they were smokers and if they had hypertension and all of those things. And the remarkable finding was actually that risk was literally half. So for the folks who were the most optimistic versus the least optimistic, they would have the likelihood of developing heart disease in that period of time.
Got it? Take home.
One of my favorite sort of next pieces of the story is that finding has been replicated very, very consistently in multiple different cohorts with multiple different samples, not just in the US, in men and in women. It appears to be an incredibly stable finding. So the next question is, what are the mechanisms? We were just recently funded to do some work looking at optimism and exceptional longevity to try to understand the role of optimism in aging and if it reduces the sort of the aging process in some way, trying to understand both the biological and the behavioral mechanisms. So we've now found linkages with optimism reduces likelihood of all-cause mortality. It interestingly,
what mortality?
All cause. So from any cause, wow. Yeah. But particularly with heart disease, again, and cancer, we did find some interesting relationships, and also with respiratory outcomes. So it does look like it's very, very robust. And now the challenge is to figure out both what are the mechanisms, and then we like to talk about optimism as a life skill. So that it is not necessarily either you have it or you don't, and if you don't have it, too bad for you. But it's a life skill. So what are some of
not just born.
That's right. It's not inherent. I mean, there is a certain amount of it. Some people are more predisposed to be more optimistic. Anyone who has multiple kids will tell you that, one kid can come out and be fairly happy-go-lucky, and the other one, even though you think everything is the same, can look really, really different. But that isn't to say that you can't nudge people in different directions, because these things are also socially mediated as well. So that's one of the other things we've been interested in looking at. Now, your second question was about the social stress?
Yes, stress. Well, on this optimism, is it true, I heard, that a cancer patient that is optimistic tend to have a better outcome than a pessimistic one? Obviously, not just an individual. You need a sample of big enough.
Yeah.
Any research along that line?
There is some research looking at cancer patients. So most of the work that we have done looks at people before they've gotten ill, right? So the processes that are at play before someone is sick can be quite different from the processes that happen after people are ill, because by that time, a lot of biology is already dysregulated. And so now what you're looking at are things like, are people complying with the medical regimen? Are they taking care of themselves appropriately in very particular ways? How badly was biology damaged by the time you started looking at them? There is some work suggesting that people who are more optimistic and have a greater sense of purpose will certainly have a better quality of life for the life they have left. The work on whether they will actually have longer survival has been a little bit more mixed. I wish I could say absolutely, but I have to wear my scientist hat and say not quite yet, but for sure they tend to have a better quality of life, so that what life they have left is better.
Social factors such as stress, and now we're open to the audience for a question, okay? So social factors such as stress. Is it good? Is it bad? I was told that, amateur, that a little stress is good. So, to some extent it's good. If it is no stress whatsoever, it's not so good. So maybe Hong Kong, we just got it right. Just the right amount of stress.
So this is so funny that you asked this question. This is what I started my doctoral dissertation asking this question. Is there good stress and is there bad stress? So Hans Selye, who's sort of the grandfather of the research on stress, basically had a term for what he called eustress, which was good stress. So there's good stress, like you're getting married or you're having a baby. Presumably these are all wanted activities. And this is imposing good stress. But then there's bad stress, which is, you you can't find enough food to put on the table and your kids are doing really poorly and so forth. So what I will argue is the word stress is this unfortunate kind of big bucket that means all kinds of different things to different people, and it has as many definitions as there are people that you ask what the definition of stress is, but it's very non-specific. So the idea of stress is that the demands that are required, that are being asked of you exceed your capacity to cope. So what happens is in the kind of formal theories about stress is people who are experiencing high levels of stress, whereas they feel like demands exceed their capacity to cope, will go on to experience negative emotions. They'll go on to experience anxiety, anger, depression, depending on, sort of the particular situation. If they don't feel like demands exceed capacity to cope, then they actually have what we call kind of a benign reaction, or they may even be feeling good because things are going well. And so part of the problem with when we measure stress is it's a little bit nonspecific, and we often don't look at what are the resources people bring to bear when they're coping, right? So some difficult event happens, and one person looks like they're having a terrible time, and someone else looks like they're doing fine, and the person who's doing fine probably has a lot of resources that they get to bring to bear. So if people in Hong Kong are highly stressed and doing well, let's just say for the moment, then the argument would be they have a lot of resources to help them manage what are the demands imposed. So if they're not doing well, then the argument would be they probably don't have enough resources, and then they probably have high levels of anxiety and depression and so forth. And those are the things that we would want to measure. But I would prefer to say a little stress is not a good or a bad thing. It really depends on what resources you have in order to manage the demands that are imposed.
I think that's actually the critical point. I think it's not stress per se. I think all of us have stress. All of us go through stress. But I think the notion is, so what kind of a social support do you have? What kind of policies, what kind of systems do you have in place individually and socially that can help you manage and cope with stress and bounce back? The whole idea of resilience, again, that's a whole debate by itself. How do you bounce back from stressful circumstances or adverse events? I think these are the critical things that actually make bigger difference than stress per se.
I just can't stop asking questions. How about community? The support from a family or so, because Professor Marmot mentioned that the other day. right here on this
Yes.
stage. Is that something critical? So do the Indian population, Chinese population, where family units are stronger. Is that how does it play out into positive health?
Yeah,
and
actually,
well-being?
I think if you want to policies in place and some of these interesting data that measure happiness, actually, social capital is one example. The notion of social support and and reciprocity, where you have these relationships with people who support each other, I think matters a lot. I think Laura mentioned social isolation. I think is another major factor. I think how do you connect people? How do you engage people? Your sense of purpose doesn't come internally or inherent, but it comes from actually experiencing and engaging with the world. I think so. It matters a lot to be engaged with the world, to have that kind of support, to have people, families, and associations that are around you supporting you on these things.
Questions?
Oh, can I just
Yeah,
add
please.
one other?
Yes,
So one
Laura.
other thing I will add is, in the realm of we haven't spent very much time thinking about these questions, but they are pretty important, is to think about what are the resources that people could bring to bear that would enable them to cope with the demands of life. So for sure, family support, family harmony, family function is a really important resource. It hasn't gotten as much attention, certainly in the U.S., in terms of whether or not it would be considered a stress buffer and so forth. I will say we have a student actually at school who's looking into this question right now, looking at positive family environments and brain architecture, and has been finding some very interesting findings on sort of brain function in early childhood relevant to being in a more positive versus less positive family environment. So these are really important issues and potential resources. There are probably others that we haven't really thought as much about in terms of community and even sort of workplace organization that all have, something to contribute. And again, if you open up the question to think about resources as opposed to thinking about deficits, I think it allows you to ask these really great questions.
Okay, anybody? At the back? It's a student table. By the way, we have a student from Baptist University, Chinese University, and Hong Kong University. They've got the first crack, so please.
I'm from University of Hong Kong, and I have two questions for both of you. And first question is for Laura. So you just mentioned positive psychology, but people mostly, like you just mentioned, we mostly measure a negative part. So do you think right now we promote people who have negative part to change their behaviors to the normal issue, for example, no smoking, no alcohol drinking, or change their negative thinking to the normal issue. But when you mention positive part, do you think that then people who have normal status, they also need to change? If so, then we have a lot of people can be categorized into the so-called negative part. So how to capture this issue? And relevantly, do you think it is a personal individual responsibility or a society responsibility, or it's kind of collective for both? For which, I think when we talk about promote, you just mentioned about transferring the scientific findings from the scientific field to the society field. But for example, like behavior change, for example, smoking or alcohol drinking, or even vaccination, we have a lot of enough concrete scientific findings. We've already put it into the public field, but public didn't change until there are some policy put into it. But for example, I think vaccination can be an example for influenza in the US. This year, the vaccine rate dropped just because so-called fake news. So as well, do you think it is personal responsibility or government should pull in more policy into it? Thanks.
Laura first and Avish.
Okay, these are great questions. So one of the issues is most of the time when we administer measures to look at people's psychological states, and particularly when we're doing our monitoring studies, at least in the US and elsewhere, we usually just ask about bad stuff, right? So we ask people, the most commonly used measure is depression, right? So we ask people, are you depressed? And the assumption has been that if people say they are not depressed, that means they are doing really well. And one of the cases we've made for a while now has been to say, just because you're not depressed, doesn't necessarily tell you that someone is doing really well. It tells you that they're not depressed. But there are plenty of people who are not depressed who may not actually be, higher on the continuum of positive psychological well-being. But if you don't measure psychological well-being, all you measure is depressed, yes or no, you really won't know that. So to your question, probably in that group of people who don't look like they're actively distressed, some of them are sort of not bad, but not doing great, and some of them are really doing really well. And the only way to know that would be to implement those kinds of measures to allow you to tease that apart in a much more thoughtful way. So it's a really good question. It's something I tell my students all the time, actually, is just because someone tells you they're not depressed does not mean they're doing well. It means they're not terrible, which is good. I mean, we want that, but we would rather know, where are they on the spectrum when we really look at the full spectrum, when we don't just limit the spectrum to, really bad or not terrible, right? So that's one answer. To your question about personal versus community responsibility, I actually think the answer is both. I was sharing with some folks at my table at lunch, with one of the first studies I came out with in my career was looking at the role of worry in heart disease. We found that people who were more worried were at greater risk of heart disease. And my biggest fear was that the headline that was going to come out of that was, "Don't worry, be happy." Because I sort of felt like, for a lot of people, the worry is realistic. They live in really difficult conditions. They are managing really serious demands. And to simply say to them, well, just don't worry about it, seems very naive and unrealistic. So you really do have to recognize that there are all kinds of social constraints around in people's worlds that drive those feeling states. And one of the things we've been really interested in is psychological factors as they translate what's happening in the larger social environment into the individual health outcomes. So certainly there's a certain extent to which individuals have a responsibility to notice if they are experiencing a lot of negative emotions and try to address it. But on the other hand, we also have to be thinking about it as a society. What are the structural constraints on people's lives? What are they able to do or not able to do because of the way that society is organized? And that's where government and policies, as well as, organizations, so businesses and workplaces and communities and neighborhoods have a really important role to play. So I think the answer is both. But more often people assume it lies with the individual and that it's just a psychological issue. And what I've tried to argue in much of the work we've been doing is it is well beyond a psychological issue. That's where you get the signal, but it is a much greater responsibility held by all, really.
Vish, you have the last word.
Yeah, sure. So I think this dichotomy that we continue to foster between individual or agency versus society, I think is flawed. And this is a huge problem. I think this is a huge problem. And smoking is a good example. If you look at the data on smoking, 70% of the smokers want to quit, right? They do want to quit, but they are unable to quit, right? The question then is, why is it that they're not able to quit, right? And there are, and to address your question, actually we have been successful in communicating with people about the ill effects of smoking. In fact, if you look at smoking policies, which I take as an example, as an illustration for this larger question, there are 4 things that happen with smoking, right? Public communication campaigns, policies restricting access for youth, advertising restrictions, and Indoor Clean Air Act. Right? All these 4 policies together contributed to the success of smoking campaigns. Is it agency? Of course it's personal agency, but it's more to do with the policies that actually led to the improvement in smoking rates. Hong Kong is a model for that. There are only 10 to 11% of the people adults smoke here. In fact, with Sophia, we published a paper in Hong Kong, ex-smokers are happier than non-smokers in Hong Kong. So there is that sense of accomplishment, right? Purpose. So I do think...
Don't say that. They'll start smoking and then try to quit.
Right. That's one way to promote happiness. Start smoking and then quit. I can see the headlines tomorrow. Harvard professors promote smoking. But the point, I think, is, I think it's a flawed dichotomy in my view. I think both agency is important, but if we ignore the society and social constraints and social conditions, I think we do it at our own peril, I think.
Before I give the wonderful gift to the two speakers, I want to thank Michelle Williams, the Dean of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. It is one thing to have a school named after your late father, but if the dean is no good, then the value is going to go down. So thank God we have a good dean, so the value is going to go up. So David, same with your center. You have great co-directors here. Your value will go up, okay? Then secondly, I also want to thank David and your family. Really wonderful that Hong Kong should produce such wonderful families, not just in business being successful, but also giving back to society in a very meaningful way. And you pray that Laura will succeed, that Laura will get a Nobel Prize one of these days. If she does, then the center here that is named after your, the founder of your company will be known everywhere in the world, okay? So ladies and gentlemen, let's thank the two speakers. I have to do a little advertisement. We have a wonderful art exhibition in the gallery up there. I guarantee you, you will enjoy it. You'll be more happy after you visit it. Maybe you will even live 3 minutes longer. Laura? Thank you, Viv.